UN fact-finding missions report on Venezuela, crimes against humanity. Hello and welcome to this latest session in our webinar series made possible by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series at the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University here in Miami. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy and the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center. And my special thanks to Ophelia Riqueses in the Václav Havel Program for putting this event together. I'm David Kramer, a senior fellow in the Havel Program here at FIU, and want to welcome you to today's session. Last week, the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Venezuela, created by the UN Human Rights Council in 2019, presented its report to the Council. The more than 400-page document offers key evidence and chilling details of the extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, sexual violence, and cases of torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment committed in the country since 2014. The mission statement clearly implicates Nicolás Maduro and senior regime officials, concluding that the abuses follow a systematic and widespread course of conduct and thus amount to crimes against humanity. The top leadership, the report states, are not only well aware of the crimes, but directly involved in their commission, in some cases, quote, ordered or contributed to, close quote, to the abuses. Far from being isolated acts, one commission member said, these crimes were coordinated and committed pursuant to state policies with the knowledge or direct support of commanding officers and senior government officials. We've assembled a terrific panel here today to discuss this report and what it means. And with us this morning are Carrie Filippetti, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Cuba and Venezuela in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. Geraldo Bertin is Director of Latin America and Caribbean Programs at Freedom House in Washington, D.C. Angelina Jaffe is a Venezuelan lawyer and professor of international law and human rights at Universidad Metropolitana in Caracas. Elizabeth Premendorfer is Senior Human Rights Officer with Global Center for Responsibility to Protect. And last but certainly not least is Luis Guillermo Solis, former president of Costa Rica and director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center here at FIU, our co-partner in today's event and a very good friend. So we're going to start with Carrie Filippetti with some opening comments on the report. So Carrie, let me turn it over to you. Thanks very much for being here with us this morning.
David, thank you so much, and many thanks to Florida International University and our other panelists. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Geraldo, President Solis, Angelina, and Elizabeth today. So we're here to talk about, as you described, the earth-shattering results of the Human Rights Fact-Finding Mission inside Venezuela. I say earth-shattering, but the truth is this torture has been known to all of us Venezuela watchers for some time. Previous oral and written reports by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, have highlighted rampant extrajudicial killings, human rights violations by the regime and its insiders, and of course, harassment and torture committed by regime security forces. One thing that I think this report does especially well, though, is that it really personalizes the horror experienced by Venezuelans. I want to share one of the examples from the fact-finding mission because I think we very frequently focus on these larger statistics and we lose sight of the actual individual lives that are involved. On January 21st, 2019, Sergeant Luis Alexander Bandres Figueroa published a video in which he and dozens of other members of the National Guard disavowed the Maduro regime. Sergeant Bandres and these other officers were arrested, and according to the United Nations, after refusing to falsely implicate leading opposition members, DHCM officers, quote, attached his arms to the ceiling with handcuffs and suspended him for 2 days, causing him to lose feeling in his arms and hands. And this is going to be a continued quote from the fact-finding mission. They hit him with a bat and kicked him, including in his testicles. They asphyxiated him with a bag, electrocuted him in different soft parts of his body, including behind his ears and on his testicles. When Sergeant Bandres fainted from the electrocution, they poured water on his body and electrocuted him again. He lost control of his bowels and the officers forced him to eat his own waste. Sergeant Bandres was deprived of water and food throughout this time and was told that his wife and children had also been tortured. Later, Sergeant Bondres was subject to an attempted rape using a pickaxe handle, end quote. So Sergeant Bondres remains in prison today. Someone who does not remain in prison is Fernando Alban. He was a board member of Primera Justicia, which, as we all know, is a leading opposition party. He did what many political leaders do precisely around this time of year, which is that he went to the United Nations, he went to UNGA in New York to participate in side events. And he landed back in Venezuela on October 5th, 2018. He called his wife, informed her of his arrival. And then 3 days later, Mr. Alban was dead. The regime had painted it as a suicide for years, but evidence has always suggested otherwise. In the fact-finding mission's report, Mr. Alban is listed among others dead in Sabine custody, and clear discrepancies in the regime's reporting of his death are detailed. His crime, like Sergeant Bondres, was that he refused to falsely implicate opposition leaders. He did not kneel to the Maduro regime. And for that, he and thousands like him were murdered. But it's not just the security forces that commit these acts. The judicial branch is forced into subservience as well. Judges who made what were deemed improper decisions had false and, in some cases, ill-defined charges levied against them. And others were threatened with retaliation should they not, quote, kneel to the executive branch. The report details regular beatings, electric shocks, death threats, threats of rape, sensory deprivation, and asphyxiation. What is most horrifying about this report, however, is not the nature of this crime, which has been whispered around for quite some time, but as you said, it is the fact that the report for the first time concludes that these violations and crimes were committed as part of a widespread and systematic attack directed against a civilian population. The UN concludes that there are reasonable grounds to believe the Maduro regime and its top ministers are complicit in these crimes against humanity. So this is not ad hoc. This is not lawlessness. This is law under the criminal Maduro regime. So the fact-finding mission gives us this extremely important, independent, rigorously documented assessment, which the international community is morally obligated to act upon to hold the regime accountable. Actions like what are referred to in the fact-finding mission report are the type of barbarism that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says should, quote, outrage the conscience of mankind. But it's really important that we not just stop at that outrage. We need to take action. So I want to describe a couple of the things that the United States is looking at in terms of what those actions can do. So first and foremost, we need to ensure that the fact-finding mission is given another mandate to build upon its current work. This is under discussion for this current session of the Human Rights Council, and the importance of the first mandate really necessitates that we continue to build upon this knowledge and documentation. Second, we need to ensure accountability for these crimes and crimes that will be uncovered by the continuation of the fact-finding mission should it pass the Human Rights Council this session. This can be done in the way that it has in the past. So for example, multiple countries in the region have already issued an ICC referral for the Maduro regime, and continuing to issue those referrals and building upon the fact-finding mission will help provide the evidence necessary to turn this into a real investigation. It's also important that we ensure accountability through the invocation of individual sanctions. The fact-finding mission does something really useful, which it provides open source information that other countries like the European Union, like the United States, can use in order to develop these sanctions targets and hold individuals accountable. The international community would really do well to mine this report for that information to ensure that we're protecting the people of Venezuela and using all of the tools available to us to do so. Third, the disconnect between the Human Rights Council finding reasonable grounds to determine the Maduro regime is complicit in crimes against humanity and the presence simultaneously of the Maduro regime on the Human Rights Council really should make us all sick. When the international community determines enough is enough, we need to make sure that the members of the Human Rights Council don't read as a list of the world's most egregious human rights violators. We have Venezuela on the Human Rights Council. We may have Cuba, China. You know, we need to find a mechanism to ensure that the Human Rights Council returns to its original purpose, which is to defend the victims of human rights abusers, not to defend the abusers themselves. Fourth, and perhaps most critically for Venezuela, We need to understand what this fact-finding mission means in the context of the broader parliamentary elections that are set to take place on December 6th. This report is yet another example among hundreds as to why the Maduro regime cannot continue its usurpation in Venezuela. There is no chance that a regime that systematically rapes, tortures, and murders political dissidents, or even those who merely refuse to themselves falsely accuse dissidents, will meet international standards for free and fair elections. Free and fair elections are impossible in a context in which the population has been trained to fear the security forces or trained to believe a vote in the, quote, wrong direction could result in imprisonment or worse. This is one of the many reasons why the United States has been clear from the get-go that Maduro must go in favor of a transitional government charged with organizing free and fair presidential elections. While he is in power, the repressive security apparatus will continue to defend his rule instead of the Constitution and instead of the people of Venezuela, whom it is charged to protect. And while he is in power, censorship will continue to run rampant, with individuals being silenced or disappeared if they share a pro-opposition view. While he is in power, we will simply just see a repeat of May 2018, yet another fraudulent election intended to generate false legitimacy to a clearly illegitimate regime. So we're working closely with our partners to ensure that no legitimacy is provided to the criminal Maduro regime, that we unite in our insistence that until the Maduro regime meets all international standards for free and fair elections, not merely postponement, not merely one or two, but all of them identified by the international community, we will not recognize the December 6th parliamentary elections. We will only recognize the will of the Venezuelan people. And ultimately, it's important to note that the parliamentary elections themselves will solve nothing, not just because they're fraudulent, but because once again, this report shows us that what we need is a change in power. We need presidential elections determined by the will of the people as achieved in a free and fair elections. We need all government branches and institutions to be renewed under an inclusive government of transition committed to stop the Maduro regime pattern of international crimes and crimes against humanity. And then the last thing that I would just say is that obviously, you know, as we talk about the Venezuelan election, there's also an election coming up in the United States. One thing that we're very, very proud to say is that there remains strong bipartisan support for the policy in Venezuela. And regardless of what happens in the United States in November, we are confident that we will continue to exert pressure against the Maduro regime. The American system, all Americans are really united in this effort to ensure that we are protecting the people of Venezuela, that we are returning the sovereignty of Venezuela to the people of Venezuela, and that we will stand by them alongside them as they fight for democracy. So thank you very much for the opportunity to participate, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Barry, thanks very much for a very clear presentation, and particularly in these polarized times, let me just say I appreciate your last comment that there is bipartisan support on this. That is reassuring to hear. Angelina, if I could start with you to get your reaction to the report and the reaction that is occurring inside Venezuela as well. If you could give us your thoughts, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I have some brief remarks on the report. This report distinguished itself from other reports on human rights in Venezuela because it established clearly the chain of command and the responsibility from the torturer and up until Maduro himself. This is very important. And secondly, it qualifies the tortures and the crimes committed in Venezuela in one of the 4 groups of international crimes, which is crimes against humanity. It's the first time. And that widens the perspective of international justice to have actions in what is happening in Venezuela, particularly in the International Criminal Court and the universal jurisdiction. In Venezuela itself, you know, Richard Goldstone, the former justice of South Africa, which was the prosecutor in Rwanda and Yugoslavia, he said once, the truth is a form of justice for people who has been deprived of dignity for 20 years now. It is very important that the world acknowledges their suffering and the lack of human rights. So it has a very important effect on people living in Venezuela, and particularly the bravery and the courage of the victims who denounced these human rights violations of the families of the victims, of the human rights activists, of the NGOs, of all those people who made it possible to put together this report during all these years, the violation of human rights. Curiously enough, the regime doesn't deny the facts. It doesn't deny the content of the report. It tries to disqualify the members of the mission. It tries to disqualify the mission itself, saying that they weren't in Venezuela, which is the fault of the government because they didn't allow them to go there. But it is not unusual for a fact-finding mission to establish a report from outside the country. It's very common, as you know, and today's technology allows that. So what the regime is doing in establishing an approach to Michelle Bachelet, trying to soften Bachelet's position because of supposed ideological identification. I don't think it will work, but as I said formerly, the regime has not denied the facts which are reported in this report. So what I would like to say is that for Venezuelans, this is perhaps the first time they acknowledge or they're aware that the world is doing something for them. And that is very important. I'm asked very often here in the United States when I give lectures in universities or think tanks, what can we do for you? And you know, when you face the repression of the state, you feel very lonely. And this is very disheartening. So to know that the world acknowledges your suffering, it's of very much help. Thank you very much.
Angelina, thank you so much for those heartfelt comments. Geraldo, if I could turn to you, please, and ask you, the human rights community has obviously been very focused for a long time on the situation in Venezuela. Give me your reaction to the report and what it means.
Well, thank you very much for inviting David and to the Florida International University. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be in this panel discussion. I'd like to continue with what Carrie and Angelina have mentioned. Let's remember that the fact-finding mission had actually three specific mandates. First of all, increase the attention to ongoing human rights violations on the ground. The second one was to implement concrete actions to address violations. And the third one, certainly, to promote further investigations into these four categories of cases on violations: arbitrary detentions, extrajudicial execution, torture, and forced disappearance in the country. So I think as such, the human rights community should look at this report not as an end in itself, but actually as a means. And certainly, because the human rights and judicial systems are broken or non-existent in the country, it is basically the international community and the human rights defenders who have the role of calling for accountability. There was, let's not forget, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights established a framework of cooperation with the Venezuelan government through a memorandum of understanding, and they already had somewhere around 23 recommendations, which according to local NGOs, I mean, none of them have been actually taken care of. So it is upon basically the international community to continue to not only showcase, but also, as Carrie and Angelina mentioned, to humanize basically the numbers behind this very damning report that kind of calls into attention the gravity of violations that are happening in Venezuela. Let's not forget also that there are precedents in these types of fact-finding missions. They were very effective in the case of Myanmar. They were very effective in the case of Libya. So I think that should give us a little bit of hope, but I agree with what was said before by Kerry. We need to continue to have this fact-finding mission extended, because the gravity and the expansion of the challenges is even farther. They have documented basically a 400 page document, and for many people that is actually not the right amount of pages for the types of activities that can actually be documented. So we will continue to call for defending the human rights defenders and democracy defenders, both in Venezuela and outside Venezuela. But I think the international community has a particular role, not only in advocating, as you're doing now with this event, and calling into attention the gravity of the issue, but also to come together and try to find basically a solution that ultimately gives a sense of hope and dignity, particularly to the victims and the families of the victims who certainly have been damaged for the rest of their lives. Yeah.
Geraldo, thanks so much. Appreciate those comments very much. Elizabeth, if I could turn to you next, please. Your reaction to the report. I also wonder if you have any comment, a point that Kerry made that I think is quite striking, that this was a fact-finding mission appointed by the UN Human Rights Council at a time when Venezuela is in fact on the council. Your reaction to that as well, please. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. And let me just very briefly extend a warm hello to all my dear colleagues on this panel. And of course, particular thanks to the Václav Havel program and the Stephen J. Green School for bringing us together. My own organization, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, and I echo the calls of everyone else here on this panel, thinks that this report in a way really constitutes, I think, a milestone for victims of systematic and widespread violations and abuses in Venezuela. An independent HRC mandated mechanism, as you said, David, has documented that they in fact may amount to crimes against humanity. And I think this is something that, you know, we have seen from human rights defenders and activists from Venezuela who have been reporting, documenting, collecting information, warning about this for many, many years. But to have an independent UN mechanism, to have this in writing by such a mechanism, this is remarkable, because it really sheds light on the experience of victims and their families who are still waiting for justice to this day, but who also know that the perpetrators are actually still out there, and a lot of them actually remain in very high positions of power. And there are many, many different aspects about the report that I think are you know, really worth a discussion. But let me focus on one thing that really struck me the most. The narrative of the report that has, you know, the narrative that has come out since the report was published is very much on accountability, and this is absolutely essential. The fact-finding mission has specifically encouraged UN member states to consider legal actions on a national level. It has mentioned, you know, the role of the International Criminal Court. And this is really why such an investigative mechanism, and we've seen this with other examples and they've been mentioned before, are really crucial in contributing to accountability processes. But I think that this report, to me, it does something else, which is really important. In the world of atrocity prevention and R2P and in our work, we oftentimes use words like warning signs and risk factors when we talk about country situations where we fear that there is a risk of atrocity crimes being committed. And this report, to me, does precisely that. It outlines structures of power, it outlines a clear state policy, and it also outlines, you know, that the state policy was is being pursued at the highest level of government, of security and intelligence. And so what it does is it really helps us to understand that the government, which has committed possible crimes against humanity in the reporting period, It's not just that these crimes have taken place, but that all the institutional and the structural factors which have in fact facilitated the commission of these crimes, they remain in place today. We have high-level officials, again, on a presidential, ministerial level, intelligence, security, who are still in power. The security forces that have been identified as the main perpetrators have not been dismantled, have not been reformed. There are no genuine investigations on a domestic level. And the government of Venezuela, as you have pointed out, David, is not cooperating with the human rights system, including genuine cooperation with the Office of the High Commissioner, and also, of course, including cooperation with the fact-finding mission, which is shameful, considering that they are on the council. And in addition to that, a gradual erosion of democratic space and the rule of law, and this is clearly outlined in the report, has contributed to really an environment which just enables these violations and abuses. The fact-finding mission has made very concrete recommendations, not towards other bodies or agencies, but specifically towards the government of Venezuela. Cease public rhetoric, ensure investigations, reform the security forces, stop using military tribunals, cooperate with UN human rights mechanisms. So what this report does to me, in addition to pushing for accountability and providing us with all the information that we need, and that is crucial. But in addition to that, it also really helps us to understand what has to fundamentally change and what has to be reformed on a national level, on an institutional level, to reduce the risk that these crimes continue. So I'll end here, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks a lot, David.
Elizabeth, thank you very much for those comments. Appreciate it. President Solis, let me turn to you, your reaction to the report, and also if you could maybe give us a little flavor of the regional reaction to the report as well. Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much to all our distinguished panelists for their very their extraordinary contributions. I think that I can only concur with everything that has been said. The report is damning for the Maduro regime. It is relevant in terms of what it adds to international law issues, and it's a step forward in the protection of human rights world over. It is timely because it happens during the time of the General Assembly of the United Nations and a few months before the elections, the legislative elections in Venezuela. It shows a pattern. There's no accident here. This is not coincidental. Things are happening not because of simply is it's accidental. It's not. There's a path to becoming for that regime becoming a dictatorship, and it highlights one of the most heinous conditions in today's political systems and the international system in general, which is the reality of crimes against humanity that continues to be a daily occurrence, which is something that's deplorable. So I feel that not only is the report very sound, well-grounded, it's based in a huge amount of legal norms which are outlined in the report itself. It brings about specific responsibilities, but it's corroborating something that we've known, as I said, for a long, long time, for many, many, many years. The big issue here, and I think that in general, it is going to be very much supported by governments all over the place, including in Latin America, where these occurrences, unfortunately, have been frequent in the past. But the real issue here is around one thing that Madam Deputy Assistant Secretary mentioned, and that's what are the consequences of this to the Maduro regime? How are we going to ensure that what the report says brings forth change? This is not the first report of this nature. It has already been mentioned, the fact that we had a very damning report as well from former President Bachelet and the Commission. It has been Similar reports have been issued in the situation in Nicaragua by the OAS and the Independent Experts Commission there in 2019. And if nothing happens in this case, we're going to be in the worst possible scenario, which is having a report that's absolutely clear regarding the nature, the dictatorial nature of that regime, the brutality of the acts it's committing, because it's an ongoing process. It's nothing that ceased a while back. It's an ongoing process. And yet the international community can do nothing about it. Yes, it is true that the report puts forth a number of recommendations. I think it is very valuable and very courageous that they request the Maduro regime to do their job in ensuring that those violations are prosecuted and punished. But we know that it takes more than a calling from the international community. It is here where I find more difficulties. Yes, we should continue pursuing, bringing the case to the ICC. Yes, we should be exerting more and more pressure on the government officials. But I am not clear that this is going to go away without some kind of action regarding elections from the international community regarding the upcoming elections. And it is not that the legislative elections are going to solve the problem, because as Madam Filippetti mentioned, the legislative action is not enough. I mean, we have to go beyond that. The presidential elections, changing the constitution, the report clearly outlines the way in which the whole state apparatus has been captured, has been sequestered by the regime. So there's no independence between the branches of government. And therefore, I wonder if we should be doing something about the elections. I don't know that outrightly disqualifying elections and making it impossible for the Venezuelan opposition to deal with that issue, even in the context, in the dire context that they are, is something that we should do. Because what's the alternative? What's the alternative? What? Military action on the part of the international community? I don't see it forthcoming because of the complexities of it, and because probably it would not solve the problem either. It may make it worse, in fact. So I'll leave it here. But again, my agreement with everything that has been said, I think that this is a damning report for the Maduro regime in Venezuela.
Luis Guillermo, thanks so much. Appreciate that very much. Let me let our viewers know that we have the Q&A function. I think you all know that function from our vast experience with Zoom these days. Please use that if you want to submit questions to the panel. I'm going to go around once more. Let me start with you, Carrie. Picking up, I appreciate what you said, that there is, as I mentioned, bipartisan support for what's happening in Venezuela and what to do about it. At the same time, we are heading into an election. That's no shock. I'm not making news here in the United States, which means that we're going to be quite distracted with our own internal issues. A point person on Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, has also now taken on responsibility for the Iran portfolio as well. So give us a sense of what the U.S. is looking ahead for, say, the next 3-4 months to include the coverage of the December 6th election.
Sure. Yeah, I think obviously Venezuela has been on the president's priority list for quite some time. It's actually quite unusual for an American president to have the Western Hemisphere, a country in the Western Hemisphere, high on his priority list. But whenever he speaks about his priorities, we talk about Iran, DPRK, and Venezuela. So it's clearly something that he cares tremendously about. As you've seen, he has continued to make significant policy announcements. Just earlier this week, he made a significant change in our Cuba policy, also a policy that I work on. So he's definitely still very involved and very active, notwithstanding the campaign. It's also worth noting that none of us are running. Myself, the special representative, the Secretary of State, we are all very much focused on our foreign policy. And as you pointed out, December 6th is really a key date here. And it's not a key date because anything will change, because as President Solis mentioned, the parliamentary elections solve nothing. You know, what the real problem here is the complete takeover of all of the institutions of government, the complete de-democratization of the country that really spread democracy throughout the Western Hemisphere. So in terms of what we're focused on for December 6th, it's really to make sure that our international partners understand, once again, that the objective needs to be a presidential election that meets all of the international standards for what is considered free and fair. That means no censorship. That means the time required to audit the voting machines, which, by the way, there are currently none inside of Venezuela, just a mere 4 months out of the election. It means that political parties need to be able to run, and not just those parties that have had their leadership taken over by regime loyalists, but real opposition parties. It means that there needs to be no more fear of the security forces, which is something that the fact-finding mission points out very clearly. Myself, you know, if I were living in Venezuela, I would not feel comfortable that my vote is secure, that my vote is safe, that I will not be imprisoned or harassed for voting a way that the Maduro regime doesn't want me to do. And of course, you know, the CNE, which is their National Electoral Council, and their Supreme Court have all been taken over by regime loyalists, again, in violation of the Venezuelan constitution. So those are all of the things that we're looking to address and to change. And also to President Solis's point, he spoke about the worst possible scenario. And he described that as sort of the status quo, that nothing actually changes despite all of the evidence and documentation that we have. I think that's absolutely true, because the status quo not only means Maduro continues to be empowered to use these manipulative tactics, it also means that the criminal elements inside Venezuela, whether it's the ELN, the FARC, the colectivos, are going to continue to gain territory, gain ground, gain weapons, and turn this into a truly lawless country. So one of the main things that we're focused on is making sure that we are connecting with the international community so that we are all speaking in one voice. And the recent International Contact Group meeting, which stated very, very clearly and unequivocally that there will be no electoral observation mission sent by the EU unless all conditions for free and fair elections are met, is one example of the types of things that we're hoping to see from the international community. So I think there's still a lot more work to be done between now and certainly the US elections, and now and December 6th. And you can bet that we're continuing to work very hard on this. This remains a #1 priority for this administration.
Barry, thank you very much for that. Angelina, let me ask you how the report might play with the opposition and the reaction in the opposition, which also enables me to work in a question from Merrick Kung, who asks, does the split between Guaido and Capriles over the election make it more difficult to make change, or do you think their disagreement is valid? So Angelina, if I could ask you to address that, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, the report was well received in the opposition, and what would be a normal disagreement in a democracy, it's a tragedy when you are fighting a dictatorship. That means the unity of the opposition. So you have to see the disagreement between Guaido and Capriles in that sense. Guaido is there because of a constitutional mandate. You have to understand that. It's not that he wanted played it as an opposition leader. He was deputy, he was president of the National Assembly, there was a void of power, and so he was named president, interim president.
Angelina, sorry, your microphone I think got covered up a little bit. If you could, that's a little better right there. Yes, sorry to interrupt.
Okay, what I was saying, Guaido's figure is a constitutional figure to fill up a void of power. Capriles is a major they disagree on strategies of what to do, which is for me completely normal, a completely normal discussion in a democracy, but not in Venezuela. So yes, it weakens the opposition, without doubt. I don't think there is a clear strategy yet. It's very, very difficult to fight a regime which has no struggles, which has pretty cynical, which does not value human life. They dispose of guilty.
Angelina, again, I apologize. It's getting hard to hear you. I apologize.
better now?
Not yet. I'll tell you what, see if you can fix your mic. Let me turn to Geraldo. I'll come back to you when you have better connection. I apologize for that, Angelina. Do you want to try it real quick right now? Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect, loud and clear.
Okay, so it's very difficult to fight a regime with no scruples, with no moral standards, and basically nobody knows what to do.
Great, thank you. And sorry, thanks for adjusting for us so we could hear you better. Geraldo, what is it that the human rights community can do to keep the pressure on, whether it's to try to force more action from our governments or to push for other kinds of actions? What would you recommend?
Yes, I think, again, I will bring the view of the victims because they are relying really on the international community to get accountability in the context that basically there is no effective domestic remedy at this point. I think hearing their stories is one aspect of keeping the pressure. Again, humanizing basically the numbers behind the report is very important. I also think that there has to be, and I want to echo President Solis's earlier comments related to the regional community, because this is setting a precedent perhaps for other countries in the region. And if you look right now at the resolutions that are being worked in the context of the United Nations General Assembly, there are two very interesting views of how to continue to keep pressure. There is a resolution being sponsored by Iran, which you should read it basically with very careful eyes, of course, and there is the resolution being sponsored by a larger group, the Lima group. And the two visions of how to get accountability in these two documents should send basically not only chills, because one is kind of very much focusing on other issues, whereas the other one is really focusing on bringing accountability to bear. And because Venezuela has retracted from these regional mechanisms, such as the OAS and the Inter-American Commission Against Human Rights, probably the only hope is a larger community led by a larger number of countries who actually would be freedom and democracy fighters. So I think those are the ways in which probably we have to continue to put pressure, bring in basically names, faces to the victims. As Madame Filippetti earlier, I mean, we need to hear these stories because basically this cannot happen in the 21st century with so much technology, with so much resources. We need to continue basically and act as a group. We might have differences in terms of how to approach it, but I think all of us are in the same result oriented that they need to be accountable for.
Thanks so much, Geraldo. Elizabeth, if I can turn to you, we've got a couple questions that deal with sort of the international framework. One is from, Nevena Stojakovic, who's asking, is the UN looking into conducting similar missions in other countries in the region? And then another question, do you think the UN will validate or accept the human rights report on Venezuela? And if I could tack on one more, just if you could answer briefly, ICC proceedings take a really long time. Is that an option that could produce anything in our lifetime, not to be frivolous about it?
Thanks, David, and thanks for these questions. I'll try to be brief. And I'll start with the first one on similar missions, and I believe you mentioned in the region. So the Human Rights Council, ever since it was created, has been a mechanism that has, resorted to establishing, mandating investigative mechanisms. We have seen this for really, cross-regional countries where there is a concern about atrocity crimes and other violations and abuses taking place. We currently have a number of operational investigative mechanisms at the Human Rights Council. Venezuela is one of them, but we actually this session, we also face mandate renewals for other countries like Yemen or Burundi. If we will see in the future additional investigative mechanisms for countries in the Gulag region, I mean, this is something that is up for the Human Rights Council to decide. The way that these mechanisms are established is that you would need a country or a group of countries to take the lead to propose an initiative and to get the support. So this is really something that is up for the Council to decide. The creation of investigative mechanisms in Geneva through the Human Rights Council is usually something that is really seen as a very, very strong measure. And so this is why we, from a human rights perspective, from civil society perspective, we really welcome that the Council did so for Venezuela. But whether or not that will happen for other country situations around the world, that is really up on members of the Council, members and observers. On the question on ICC proceedings, I think this is key. The fact-finding mission has specifically, mentioned the role of the International Criminal Court, where we see a preliminary examination. And of course, the ICC, as the organ, I would say, of international justice, has a fundamental role to play. But I should perhaps stress that it's not the only mechanism, and including on an international domain. It's not the only mechanism that can contribute to accountability. And I think that, we should be creative when looking at different ways to achieve accountability. There's universal jurisdiction. There's regarding different country situations, there's hybrid courts and other ways to proceed. We've seen Myanmar, a historic decision by the government of the Gambia to actually, resort to the International Court of Justice, which was historic. So I think ICC is crucial to contribute to justice and accountability. But as an international community and member states, should look what else we can do to ensure justice and accountability.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. Luis Guillermo, let me try to summarize Fernando Campos's fairly provocative question, if I can. He's essentially saying that elections and any non-violent alternative, oops, my screen just, is simply not a solution for the country's human rights situation. The only solution, he argues, is force. This has been clear and has been demonstrated throughout 21 years. How can a military intervention be activated? One, is military intervention a good idea? Two, what are the chances that there might be some sort of military intervention coming from outside?
Well, the answer to that question is always historically determined. I mean, I think that from a principle point of view, the international community cannot endorse any unilateral action, military action, without putting the countries and the system in serious danger. I think, and then there's the practical aspects of an intervention. How much does it cost? How much it costs in terms not of material costs, which is always a concern, but in terms of human lives and the results that ultimately can come out of it. So I would like to see it as a last resort. I clearly, as a professor, I think that we have to analyze that possibility as a last resort, and within the framework of the United Nations, it is only possible within a mandate from, emanating from Chapter 7 of the Charter. So, I would like not to think that this is something that we have at hand. And then, you've already mentioned the fact that the major actors that would be involved in a presumptive military action are going through very peculiar times. The United States facing an election that's very complicated, as we all know. And then we have two other actors that have been mentioned, in the region, at least, that would eventually have to participate as well. And, it could be a very cumbersome, complicated issue. I think that prior to thinking in that situation, we have to exert all the diplomatic pressures that we can. I think that everybody has stressed at least the importance of unity of the international community, unity within the Venezuelan opposition. This is something that, that the international community cannot do alone. Yes, I know that there is a responsibility which is huge on the part of the international community, but such is the responsibility of the Venezuelan opposition. And in that sense, I think that, you know, there is the ICC. Yes, there is much more that can be done using back channels. It is essential that the European Union and the United States work together in this with the Lima Group. We've seen a very active special envoy in Mr. Abrams. Enrique Iglesias is the special envoy from the European Union. He can also work using back channels. I mean, there are a number of options that I find essential, but it's true that, you know, whatever comes out of this has to go through some kind of political action within the country. And this is why I think we have to put a lot of attention on the upcoming elections themselves. Some things have been happening within Venezuela. I don't want to exaggerate. I don't want to provide a blank check to the regime, but maybe more can be done to see in the next election something that could be a preamble of better things to come. But that entails a lot of resolution on the part of the international community to show a united front, and again, from the Venezuelan opposition as well.
Thanks, Luis Guillermo. Elizabeth, I think you wanted to jump in, so I'm going to make this the last round with you, try to work in some questions. In addition to responding to the question that Luis Guillermo just answered, let me also throw to you the question from my colleague and friend Martin Palush, who asked any message or role for the EU to play as well, please. Thanks.
Thanks, David, and thanks for giving me the floor again. I just briefly wanted to follow up to what President Solis has just said, which is precisely the conversation around the use of force. I feel like it has come up also in recent days on Twitter. We've seen a lot of conversations, what R2P means in the case of Venezuela, what means the use of force. So I perhaps just to take a moment and follow up on the remarks. And I want to emphasize, you know, what R2P doesn't mean. It doesn't permit the use of unilateral military intervention if it's not in accordance with international law. So R2P as a political commitment and as an international norm and principle is really founded in charter law and in international law. So I think that, you know, R2P includes the use of military force as a last resort measure if there is a Security Council authorization to do so. And then in addition to that, when we look at it from an R2P perspective, there are additional questions that come into the conversation and that we need to ask in the case there is an authorization, which in the case of Venezuela, I think we're quite clear won't be the case in the imminent future. So you have to ask yourself, you know, are there proportional means? What is the proper purpose? Is it to protect populations from atrocity crimes, or is it to change a government? And what is the balance of consequences? Is this a last resort measure? So just to perhaps add to the conversation, and also in case viewers were wondering about, you know, what does R2P mean and what does Pillar 3 mean in the case of Venezuela? On your question regarding the role of the European Union, yes, I think they have an absolutely key role to play. And, you know, in a way, when we talk about Pillar 3 measures under the responsibility to protect, when we call on states or regional mechanisms to uphold that responsibility, a lot of the measures that we have seen with regards to Venezuela are, in fact, R2P measures as such. The creation of, for example, the International Contact Group in a way is how you uphold R2P and how you try to respond. For the upcoming future, what I think the EU really has a key role to play in is to support the initiative by a group of countries in Geneva, which is currently negotiated, to renew, but also to strengthen the mandate of the fact-finding mission. And I think we're hearing very positive, you know, remarks on that from the EU, based on the findings of the report. But then in addition to that, again, just to come back to, you know, finding creative ways of how to ensure accountability. And in addition to that, how to continue to signal to the government that the costs of committing these violations and abuses are too high. There will be consequences through legal accountability, political accountability. Sending a message to the government, to perpetrators, to individuals involved in the commission of these violations, that justice will follow up, and there will be at some point there will be consequences for their action, making it uncomfortable for them to continue with these violations. Thanks, David.
Elizabeth, thank you. Carrie, I'm sensitive to your time constraints and want to ask you about the role of other countries in this, including one in your portfolio, Cuba. The Maduro regime gets support from Cuba, from Russia. There was a question asked by Camila Castillo about Islamic organizations as well. Can you just touch on the role that these outside players have on this and what should be done about it?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. So there's a lot of different ways that I can take this. So first and foremost, I want to just kind of respond to some of the conversations about R2P and the kinds of things that can happen in the Security Council. So one way in which actors, not so much Cuba, but actors like China and Russia can influence policies, just they have a veto on the Security Council, right? So when we talk about, the importance of moving things through the system, we have to understand that right now the system is structured so that Russia or China could unilaterally block something that is otherwise agreed to by other members of the council. And so I think it's important that we understand that, and this is partially why less has happened through the context of the Security Council than it has through the context of, for example, the Human Rights Council or these other entities within the UN system. So that's one way in which these international players affect Venezuela. The second way is just through the legitimization or the financial support. And so here we're talking about Russia, China, and also Cuba. Cuba is one of these countries that its own existence, its own survival depends on the Maduro regime being in power. And so this is why we're seeing the Cuban regime continuing to send and export its security services, leading officials. Maduro called the Cuban ambassador there basically a member of his cabinet. So, talk about violations of sovereignty. His top advisors are not Venezuelan advisors. And in fact, when you get to the root of what the fact-finding mission points out, and it says, if the Maduro regime is complicit in these crimes against humanity, and the Maduro regime is following the dictates and orders of the Castro regime, then there's a real nexus here to Cuban abuses of human rights as well inside the context of Venezuela. We're seeing how the Maduro regime is so dependent on these intelligence services that have been imported from Cuba that the Maduro regime is now sending oil, gasoline, other supplies that are really necessary inside Venezuela, experiencing shortages inside Venezuela, sending it over to Cuba instead to pay their debt for all of this intelligence service, security service, and advice. So that's one major way in which Cuba is active. And as I said, you're not going to get Cuba to change its mind on Venezuela because it needs Venezuela to continue to survive. It is otherwise extremely isolated. It's at its lowest economic point since the special period in the 1990s, and it doesn't have a replacement patron the way it did when the Soviet Union fell and they turned to Venezuela. There is no replacement Venezuela. I also would just say in terms of other partners, something that has been really highlighted here is the importance of the international community speaking in one voice. The EU, the region, we all need to be really, really careful that we stick together, that we continue to issue statements together. This was the purpose of the United States' joint declaration, which was issued with over 34 other countries that highlighted the importance of focusing on a Venezuelan-led process inside Venezuela. And I think the most important international group is the Lima Group. It's the region because I have found that very frequently we're hearing from the region that other countries are not consulting with them when it comes to what's happening in Venezuela. And we have to bear in mind, this is not just a Venezuelan problem. It may have been years ago, but it very quickly became a regional problem, specifically with the over 5.2 million refugees that are now in Ecuador, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and really all throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. So we need to make sure that we are consulting with the region on everything that we do, because they're the ones who will be the first to suffer if the Maduro regime continues to be in power.
Carrie, thank you. And I know you may have to drop before we wrap up, which we're going to do very soon. In case you do, let me just say thanks so much for joining us. Your presence in today's discussion has really been critical. So we're very grateful for having you join us. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to serve on this panel.
Thanks so much. Geraldo, if I could turn to you, there's a question again from Camila Castillo about what steps should the Venezuelan people promote to tackle cultural and structural violence? The problems go beyond. It's about the entire country's identity to some respect. How would you answer that?
Yes, that's a very, very good question. And certainly there are a number of, let's say, epicenters of action that we can activate. And again, I want to emphasize the unity message that we're trying, all of us, to give. There's a lot of diasporas actually all over the world of Venezuelan people. Certainly, the victims again are important actors in providing a voice, to the cause. Certainly, going back to the regional platforms, I want to emphasize that there are some issues that cannot have ambiguities, right? I mean, you have to be in favor of human rights. You have to be in favor of freedom. You have to be in favor of democracy. There cannot be basically a gray line. And I think that is another message that can actually be promoted. I agree that basically what's happening in Venezuela is going to affect outside Venezuela. And so therefore, whatever means we can use to reinforce principles behind the formation of the United Nations, principles of the democracy charter, principles of accountability, of transparency, the more actually we're going to be promoting this indifference really to the fact that under non-democratic regimes, all of us lose, because we lose basically our freedoms, we lose the right to speak, and that's basically very important to all of us. Again, we are in the 21st century, we cannot go back. We certainly would like to continue to move forward, and I would call basically on different levels of action, individual, organizational, regional, to emphasize basically this respect basically for human rights, and certainly again to actually not let perpetrators go without being given what they deserve for what they have done. Impunity basically needs to actually end.
Aldo, thank you so much. Luis Guillermo, let me ask you, I'll try to summarize Jack McGuire's question about sanctions. The impact they have on average citizens. Should there be a lifting of sanctions to try to make life a little better for people, or is that throwing a bone to the regime that they don't deserve?
Well, sanctions are part of real life, and in fact, they've been imposed upon Venezuela in large proportions for a long time, both sanctions that affect people as well as sanctions that affect individuals, which I think are well deserved. I mean, but we're running out of sanctions, I'm afraid. I mean, you can keep on putting sanctions, and that's not a policy. That's an excuse, it seems to me. I mean, you have to do something, oh, let's throw in some more sanctions. That's not seeking for a solution. Again, I agree with the sanctions. I think that they are probably one of the few things we can do, but you have to go beyond sanctions. And the case of Cuba is a very good example. I mean, you've had Cuba under sanctions for over half a century with very little results. And in fact, regimes can use sanctions to empower them more. So, you know, in the ultimate analysis, again, I think this has to be approached using several ways, some of them public, some of them carried out by the international community, the states, as well as non-governmental organizations. I think Elizabeth has been very, very forthcoming in what an important role they have to play. But, you know, some of the work has to be done silently. I mean, what are we going to do with Guaido once his mandate ends? Can we afford losing Juan Guaido, which has been, you know, the point of encounters of so much international support? And his mandate is going to end once the new assembly is elected. So, you know, I don't want to take, again, I don't want to underestimate the legitimacy issue here. But if the United States, for example, is negotiating with the Taliban, isn't there a case for negotiations with other regimes that are very clearly violating human rights, just as they did? I mean, we have to look beyond the box if we want to solve this in a reasonable amount of time. I'm not willing to think that we can't do that other than using military means, which again, I don't think desirable, not possible at this time.
Luis Guillermo, thank you very much. Angelina, we're a little over time, but this is your country we're talking about, and I'd like to give you the last word if I could.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
I would like to say a word about this reenactment of the Cold War in Venezuela. It's really very astonishing and troubling. And I would say also a lack of respect for the people in Venezuela who are struggling for their rights and to have free and fair elections. So that Russia, China have something to do in Venezuela is really something very troubling. And but it's a reality, we have to face it. And again, it's very hard to establish a clear line of action to reestablish democracy in Venezuela, but we are trying, and we are trying very hard. Thank you.
Angelina, thank you. And obviously we wish you and everyone in Venezuela the very best in the difficult days and weeks and months ahead. Let me thank all of you for a terrific panel. My apologies to the people who sent in questions that we weren't able to get to, but Carrie Filippetti, who had to drop off from the State Department, Geraldo Bertin, Angelina Jaffe, Elizabeth Premendorfer, and Luis Guillermo Solis. A huge thanks to all of you for a fascinating panel on a critically important issue, one that is of enormous interest to people here in this community at FIU and the broader Miami community and beyond. So a really enlightening panel. Thank you so much. And again, a huge thanks to Ophelia for the idea and pulling this all together. I'm David Kramer here at Florida International University in Miami. I want to thank you for joining this latest series in the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad lecture series here from Miami. We want to thank you, and please join us again in the future.
Thank you.